John Brown descended from Puritan ancestry. Although it is unknown exactly who his ancestors were, Brown himself believed that his first paternal ancestor in America came on the Mayflower and was named Peter Brown. There are several other theories stating that Brown's ancestors settled later on in Connecticut or Massachusetts. Maternally, there is speculation about when his family migrated to America, but his mother, Ruth Mills, was also of Puritan descent. The Puritan principles that Brown's family adopted were based upon those of Calvinism, and so he was devout, plain, and stern in his beliefs. This likely influenced Brown's radical attitude toward slavery later in his life.
Shortly before Brown's birth, his father witnessed several events which affected his opinions on slavery. Up to this time, it is unknown how Owen Brown felt about slavery. Several ministers expressed their abhorrence toward slavery in sermons that he heard. Brown also witnessed the abolition of slavery in several northeastern states and the Dred Scott case.
On May 9, 1800, John Brown was born in Connecticut and moved to Hudson, Ohio as a toddler. His father worked as a shoemaker and as a tanner to support the family. At one time, he was apprenticed to future President Ulysses S. Grant's father. As a child, Brown studied the Bible and several anti-slavery texts, including one that said slavery violates Jesus' golden rule. Moreover, he was punished harshly for everything that his father deemed unholy because his father feared that sin caused immediate damnation to hell. For example, for being unfaithful to God or for disrespecting his mother, John received 8 lashes with a whip. Later, Brown made his own children whip him whenever he sinned.
At 16 years old, Brown moved to Plainfield, Massachusetts. Here, he hoped to become a minister, but lacked sufficient funding, so he moved back to Ohio and worked as a tanner. In 1820, he married Diane Lusk and moved to Pennsylvania, where he purchased a small plot of land. He had 7 children with her and another 13 children after her death. To support his family, Brown worked as a surveyor, a farmer, and a tanner. Then, in 1837, Brown swore, "Here, before God, in the presence of these witnesses, I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery."
Brown moved to Springfield, Massachusetts 10 years later, and at this time, Springfield was the nucleus of the anti-slavery movement. He met many fellow abolitionists, notably Frederick Douglass, who furthered his hatred of slavery. He became obsessed with ending slavery, and he became radical, stating that slavery could only be ended through war. Also during this time, Brown worked as a wool trader and became extremely wealthy, although he and his partner Simon Perkins lost a large sum of money when a business venture in England ended badly. Brown founded the League of Gileadites, which opposed the Fugitive Slave Act, shortly before he moved to Elba, New York in 1859, where he lived in an African-American settlement. He spent 6 years there before moving to Kansas because his sons informed him of a dispute between the pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. He learned that the Kansas-Nebraska Act allowed lands north of Mississippi to legalize slavery. This had been illegal since 1820, and it divided the Kansas Territory into 2 new states. Kansas would be a free state and Nebraska a slave state, so Brown departed for Kansas, determined that it should all be free. Upon his arrival, Brown lived with his half-sister and brother-in-law Perella and Samuel Adair near the town of Osawatomie, which was raided and burned by pro-slavery forces in May of 1856. 3 days later, Brown and his fellow abolitionists avenged this by attacking the pro-slavery forces at Pottawatomie Creek. Here, Brown murdered 5 men at what is now known as the Pottawatomie Massacre.
During his stay in Kansas, he began planning the Harper's Ferry operation. In short, Brown planned to start a slave revolt in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and using the town's armory, he planned to arm the slaves and to march south and free more slaves, before marching north where the slaves could be free. Before this happened, Brown had to build an army, so he traveled to the northeast and asked many abolitionists to help him. Although Frederick Douglass and several others initially agreed to help him, they decided that this raid was a suicide mission and withdrew. Still, Brown managed to hire an English mercenary named Hugh Forbes to train the 21 participants. These consisted of his sons, some escaped slaves, and 3 blacks. In July of 1859, Brown and his men moved to Frederick, Maryland, where they began training for the operation. They would drill and prepare for the raid at night and during thunderstorms because it masked the sound from locusts. One of Brown's daughters and one of his daughters-in-law lived at the house and served as the sentry and the housekeeper respectively. He continued planning and preparing for the raid.
Finally, late on October 16, 1859, Brown and his men were prepared for the raid. First, they cut the lines to the town's telegraph and held a passing train hostage, removing a chance that an outsider could discover that any raid was underway. The train was later allowed to continue, and this is how authorities were informed of Brown's raid. By the following morning, Brown attacked and seized the armory. Shortly afterward, the local militia surrounded him. They forced Brown into the armory's engine house. The two sides were in a stalemate, the militia could not defeat Brown, and he could not escape. Brown waited for the area's slaves to join him, but none did, and so the standoff ensued into October 18th. Presently, 88 Marines led by Colonel Robert E. Lee arrived to assist the militia. They raided the engine house where Brown and his men were stuck, killing 10 men and capturing 7, one of which was Brown. Only 1 Marine was killed during the raid. Several citizens were also killed.
After his arrest, Brown was charged with conspiring a slave revolt, treason, and 5 counts of murder. His trial began on October 27th in Charlestown, Virginia. Brown was assigned a group of lawyers who argued that he had not personally murdered anyone, that he could not commit treason against a state that he was not a resident of, and that he had not actually interacted with any slaves. Therefore, he could not be found guilty. Nevertheless, Brown was sentenced to hanging. Awaiting his execution, Brown received many letters. Some were enthusiastic and regarded Brown as a savior, while others condemned him and called him a terrorist. Martha Doyle, who was married to a man whom Brown killed in Kansas, wrote to him,
"Although vengeance is not mine, I confess that I do feel gratified to hear that you were stopped in your fiendish career at Harper's Ferry. With the loss of your 2 sons, you can now appreciate my distress in Kansas. My son John Doyle, whose life I begged of you, is now grown up and very desirous to be at Charlestown on the day of your execution."
An anonymous free black woman wrote Brown and thanked him for his effort to free the slaves.
On the morning of December 2nd, 1859, Brown was hanged. His body was sent back to Elba, where his family still owned a homestead. On the day of his execution, Brown made what is regarded as his final prophecy. He wrote,
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done.
Brown quickly became famous for his actions against slavery. Among many, he became a martyr against slavery, while many others viewed him as a terrorist. Some say that his raid was the first battle of the Civil War. When Lincoln released the Emancipation Proclamation, a group of aristocratic New Yorkers held a party, which they called the John Brown Party. It celebrated that the slaves were to finally be free and that Brown had died for the just cause. Today, John Brown is viewed as a radical terrorist who ended slavery.